Our story begins almost immediately after the end of the Second World War, when the US Army had become curious as to how foreign-made suspension systems compared with America's own. Canada had already set up a plan to conduct laboratory soil studies, tests of different suspension systems under extreme stress, and to test new theories of soil action under tracks, which was spelled out in Canadian Technical Memorandum No. 6 from December 31st, 1945. Prior to the end of World War II, tests such as these would have been nearly impossible to carry out due to the obvious inaccessibility of foreign-made vehicles, especially German ones, which were considered the most interesting. But following the war's end, tens of thousands of potential test beds suddenly became available. And though the Canadian Army would seemingly not carry out any major testing of foreign vehicles, the US Army was very interested in the idea. That interest would only increase when in early 1946, someone working in R&D for the US Army happened to realize something. The M24 Chaffee and the SDKFZ-8 half-track have almost the same wheelbase. At that point, the gears began turning, and soon there was an interest in comparing the Chaffee's bogie wheel suspension system with the German interweaving road wheel suspension system. Now, the somewhat normal route would be to take the two vehicles and test them on either a course or on a special testing rig in a lab where you can control all the variables. Well, that's not what would happen at all. Instead, this simple moment of realization would lead to one of the most horrifying creations of the early Cold War period. That being, the Hanomag Chaffee. Now, the work to fit the SDKFZ-8 suspension to the M24 Chaffee was to be carried out under the oversight of Lieutenant Colonel L.B. Hopkins. The tracks of the Hanomag were retained along with the interweaving suspension arrangement as to provide more points of ground contact as well as using a greater pitch track. That and nobody wanted to redesign the entire running gear for what would likely be a one-off test, but still. Now, though it seems completely insane today, and likely it was then as well, to even consider such a thing as German interweaving road wheels on a Chaffee, it was believed that by eliminating the return rollers and larger road wheels, as well as introducing what was effectively a dual-purpose track, could lead to potential performance improvements for the Chaffee. The conversion work on M24 number 594 to the Hanomag suspension was to take around 5 weeks. But before the work had even been finished, red flags were already waving. Even though the M24 and the SDKFZ-8 shared generally the same wheelbase, the sprockets and idlers had to be mounted much higher up, creating horrifically increased approach and departure angles for the track. There was also the fact that the Hanomag's torsion bars had to be rearranged from the standard above and below arrangement to a side-by-side arrangement as to avoid dramatically raising the vehicle's height. This meant the running gear on one side of the vehicle was a full 4 inches forward of the other side, which raised serious questions on how badly the steering would be affected. In fact, one of many concerned letters believed it would, quote, cause the vehicle to leave the road. Another odd thing that had to be done was the turret had to be removed, as the suspension was designed for a 12-ton prime mover and would collapse under the additional weight. This means that that photograph that I know many of you have seen that's circulating around of this vehicle with a turret is a blatant fake. And I would like to point out it's not even a good one when you realize that the turret is taken from the T-24 Chaffee prototype. Despite this, work continued, and in order to create a valid comparison between the German and American suspension, another M24 was to be brought in and tested with the standard suspension, and the turret also removed. One of the first tests to be carried out was measuring the track resistance, and would be done by towing the vehicle in 3 states. First, with a transmission and transfer case in neutral with the final drives connected, then final drives disconnected, and finally with the tracks removed. After this would come deceleration testing, which should be done by running both vehicles on concrete and recording their coasting distance from different speeds. A road load and full load resistance test were attempted and were to be measured using a torque meter attached to the drive shaft. However, said torque meter could not be accurately calibrated and this test was abandoned. During the testing period, it was also planned to get drawbar pull versus track slip data in mud between the interweave suspension and the standard M24 Chaffee, though the Hanomag Chaffee was to feature an even more radical modification. The Hanomag Chaffee was to be fitted with unique drive sprockets and roller drive drives, which would allow the interweaving suspension to be run with Soviet T-34 tracks. This idea, though, was ultimately abandoned when it was predicted that the steering issues would be far too severe to handle. Now, once all the number crunching was done, it was determined that the towed resistance of the standard M24 was on average 20% more than the interweaving Hanomag suspension, which also presented 37% less towed resistance than the M24 with T72 steel tracks, and a whopping 54% less than the M24 with T35 rubber tracks at a speed of 2 miles an hour. However, the statistics did find something interesting, which was that between 15.5 to 19 miles per hour, the German suspension resistance was equal to, and in some cases greater than, the M24 with T72 tracks, and at 16.5 miles an hour, about the same as the T35 rubber tracks. Deceleration data would reveal yet another win for the Hanomag suspension when it was found that it coasted on average between speeds of 15 to 20 miles an hour about 100 feet more than the standard bogey wheel Chaffee, fitted with T72 steel tracks, and at 10 miles an hour about 65 feet more, and at 5 miles an hour that advantage was only about 30 feet. Do keep in mind, though, that almost none of the deceleration data was entirely accurate for the Hanomag-equipped vehicle, as corrective steering was required for most of the testing. That being said, the numbers had shown that the German suspension ultimately led to less power consumption at low speed on hard pavement. The testing that was to take place in the mud was where the real nightmare began, as each and every single attempt to get the Hanomag Chaffee going ended in disaster, as steering the vehicle would nearly instantly throw the tracks off the sprocket or idler, sometimes both at the same time, and would even throw both tracks off at the same time. This was likely due to the issues eerily forewarned early on during the conversion work that the altered track approach and departure angles could lead to issues, as well as the repositioned torsion bars. It's worth pointing out that ride characteristics tests were also pretty much impossible, as the top of the track could not be made level due to the sprocket and idler arrangement, and suffered from horrific slapping when attempting to steer or brake. It was also found that the road wheels were rather frail and could be damaged and knocked out of alignment very easily. But one enormous issue would crop up that nobody saw coming, which was that the German rubber track pads tended to wear out very fast, which would eventually lead to the track shoes basically destroying themselves on hard surfaces. There was an attempt to secure more of these track pads from the junkyards of Europe, but none were ever delivered, meaning any extensive performance and durability tests were not possible. Eventually, after all the work, technical problems, and severe headaches, it was ultimately determined that the standard M24 Chaffee was more than capable of propelling itself at low speed, and that there was no real advantage to a slightly less power-consuming suspension, which only really perform better at low speeds on pavement. And also, due to all the problems encountered in the mud, there wasn't even a comparison to be made in off-road performance. Due to all of this, further testing of the vehicle was halted, and unfortunately, the fate of the Hanomag Chaffee is unknown, but it was either returned to its original configuration, or was just outright scrapped. That was the video. Anyway, hope you all enjoyed it. You know, I've been looking at this whole subscriber thing, and 18k subs is kind of crazy if you really think about it. I want to thank all of you for this, and the fact that I've reached the point where now I can actually monetize this stuff. I don't really know what else to say here, other than just to say I appreciate you all. I hope these videos bring a little bit of laughter to your day. I don't know. Anyway, I shall see you all in the next video. In the meantime, I shall return to the 7th dimension. So, bye, I guess?
I summon the one and only Ferdinand Porsche. Kill this man.